The chamber went silent the moment Owen Hale stood up. I was seated 3 rows behind the human delegation, close enough to see his hands. They were steady. That was the first wrong thing. Every species I had ever watched stand before the Galactic Council showed some sign of nerves, some small tell. Owen Hale showed nothing. "Effective immediately," he said. "The United Nations of Earth withdraws from every treaty, every trade agreement, and every seat this council has ever offered us. We will not be filing an appeal. We will not be requesting a review. This is not a negotiation." For a moment, nobody breathed. Then the chamber erupted. I want to explain, before anything else happens, why this mattered so much. On any other day, in any other galaxy, a single species walking away from a council of 1,000 worlds would be a footnote, a curiosity, something the historians mention once and forget. But humanity was not a footnote. Humanity was the fastest-growing trade partner in known space, the only species in 3 centuries to double its fleet output every decade, and the quiet, unspoken reason half the wars in this sector had not already started. Diplomacy was not just talk here, it was law. It was the only thing standing between 1,000 species and open conflict. Without a treaty, there was no protection, no shared law, no shield. A species without diplomatic standing was, by every practical measure, alone. And Owen Hale had just set that shield down in front of everyone and walked away from it. Ambassador Hale, the council speaker, a tall being named Ren Corvain, rose from the high seat. His voice cracked, just slightly, the first time in all the years I had watched him preside that I had heard it do that. "You understand what you are proposing. Without council protection, your species has no standing in any dispute. No claim to contested territory. No right to call for aid." "We understand," Owen said. "Then why?" Owen looked around the chamber slowly, and when his eyes passed over me, I felt something I had not expected to feel from a human. Not anger. Something closer to grief. "Because we asked," he said. "For 6 years, we asked, we filed, we waited, we compromised. We took every insult this chamber gave us, with a smile, because we were told that was how the system worked. Well, we are done asking." He turned and walked out. His delegation followed him. Nobody stopped them. Nobody knew how. I sat there in the noise that followed, the arguing, the confusion, the sudden flurry of aides rushing toward the exits to find someone, anyone, who might explain what had just happened, and I realized I did not understand it either. I had lived among humans for 4 years as a cultural liaison. I had eaten their food, learned their languages, watched their strange sports and stranger arguments. I thought I knew them. I did not know this version of them. My name is Vesa Andrel. I am a Shari, which means very little to you unless you know my people. So I will simply say this: we are slow to anger and slower to forgive, and we pride ourselves on patience. It is why the council trusted my people to manage the human file in the first place. They thought we would keep humans calm. Instead, I was the one who had to explain, in the hours after that walkout, why calm had run out. The speaker called me to his private chamber less than an hour after the session ended. He did not sit, he paced, which for a being of his composure was as good as shouting. "You have lived with them," he said. "You have eaten at their tables. Tell me what I am missing." "I am not certain you are missing anything," I said. "I think you simply did not believe them." "Believe them about what?" I hesitated, because the answer was going to sound foolish, and foolish answers rarely survive contact with powerful people. But it was the truth, so I gave it to him. "They told us, Speaker, many times, in small meetings, in formal complaints, in the reports my own office filed and forwarded up the chain for the last 2 years. They said the system was failing them, and that patience is not the same thing as consent. We did not listen because we assumed they would keep participating regardless. Because that is what smaller species have always done, what newer species have always done. Humanity is not small." "No," I said, "it is not, and I believe we are only now understanding what that means." He stared at me for a long moment, then waved a hand toward the door, dismissing me without another word. I left his chamber with a knot in my stomach that would not loosen for days. That night, I did something I was not authorized to do. I opened the archive of council rulings from the past year, the ones nobody reads unless they are looking for something specific, and I began searching for the word human in every resolution passed in the last 18 months. I found it on the 11th document. It was buried in a routine trade adjustment, the kind of paperwork that moves through committee without a single senator reading past the summary line. A border dispute over a mining route near a system humans called Corvid's Reach, a route their scouts had charted, their engineers had built the first relay stations on, and their treaty had protected for 9 years. The ruling reassigned it, not to humans, to a species called the Taurini, on a technicality involving an outdated survey boundary that had been redrawn without anyone from Earth being formally notified until after the vote had already passed. I sat back in my chair and felt something cold settle into my chest. They had not been angry about losing the mining route. Species lose territory disputes all the time. It is the nature of a crowded galaxy. What they had been angry about, I now understood, was smaller and far more dangerous. They had been quietly, procedurally erased from a decision that affected them, by a system that was supposed to guarantee they would always have a voice in it. And when I kept reading, I found it was not the only time. There were 4 more instances, going back 3 years, where human objections had been filed, acknowledged, and then buried under procedural delay until the window to appeal had simply closed. Every single time, the official explanation was the same: backlog, scheduling, committee availability. Every single time, it happened to be humanity's file that stalled. I do not think anyone on this council set out to cheat them. I think it was worse than that. I think it was simply easier to make humans wait, because humans, unlike older and more established species, had no old alliances to call in, no ancient debts owed to them, no senator who owed their seat to a favor from Earth. They were new, they were useful, and it is a terrible thing to admit, but usefulness without leverage is not the same as respect. I brought my findings to the speaker the next morning. He read through my notes without a word, his expression unreadable, and when he finished, he set the tablet down very carefully, as though it might shatter. "You are telling me," he said, "that we did this to ourselves. I am telling you, they read every rule we ever gave them, followed it perfectly, watched us fail to follow it back, and drew the only reasonable conclusion available to them, that the rules were never meant to protect them at all. And the walkout is not a tantrum, speaker, it is a verdict." He did not respond to that. He simply stood at the window of his chamber, looking out over the spires of the council station, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked less like the most powerful diplomat in known space, and more like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was not as solid as he believed. I did not know yet how right he was to worry. None of us did. We assumed, foolishly, that humanity leaving the table meant humanity stepping back, going quiet, retreating to their own systems to nurse a grievance while the rest of the galaxy carried on as it always had. We did not yet understand that humans do not measure safety by how loudly they speak. They measure it by what they are prepared to do when they finally stop. Within 2 days, the first ripple reached us, and it did not come from Earth. It came from a species called the Drenic Combine, longtime rivals of humanity's shipping lanes, who had spent a decade quietly resenting how much of the trade routes near their border had shifted toward human control. Word spreads fast in a chamber like ours, and the Drenic delegation had heard, correctly, that humanity now had no treaty, no protection, and as far as anyone could tell, no allies willing to speak for them. I remember the exact words their ambassador used in the corridor outside the main hall, not realizing I could hear him. "An unclaimed border is an invitation," he said to one of his aides, smiling in a way that made my skin feel too tight for my body. "Let us see how loudly they speak, now that no one is listening." I wanted to warn someone. I did not know yet that the warning would not matter, because humanity had already stopped waiting for permission to protect what was theirs. That would become clear soon enough. But on that second night, all I had was a knot of dread in my chest, a stack of buried rulings on my desk, and the growing, uncomfortable certainty that the Galactic Council had just made the single greatest miscalculation in its long and self-satisfied history. We had assumed silence meant surrender. We had no idea what it actually meant until the first ship crossed the line. It happened 4 days after the walkout, and I only know the details because Daniel Rourke told me himself, sitting across from me in a station cafe that no longer felt like a safe place to talk, though neither of us said so out loud. Daniel had been a mid-level attaché with the human delegation, the kind of quiet, careful man who does the real work while ambassadors give speeches. I had known him for 2 years. He had a habit of tapping his knuckles against the table when he was choosing his words carefully, and he was doing it now. "You heard about Corvid's Reach," he said. It was not a question. "I read the ruling," I said. "The one that reassigned the mining route." "Then you know the Taurini moved a survey fleet in 3 days after the vote passed. Standard procedure. Establish presence, claim the resource, dare anyone to argue." He paused, except there was no one left to argue with them, no treaty, no council obligation on our side to even inform anyone what we did next. "What did you do?" He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face made me wish I had not asked. "We removed them," he said simply. "No violence, no weapons fired. Every ship in that survey fleet found its navigation systems locked out, its communications rerouted through an automated channel that told them, very politely, that the system belonged to Earth, and that they had 6 hours to leave the way they came. They left in 5. I sat back, stunned. That should not be possible. A fleet's systems are sovereign. No outside signal can simply... "It shouldn't be possible for most species," Daniel said. "It has been possible for us for a long time. We simply never had a reason to show anyone." I did not sleep well that night. Not because of what he described, though it unsettled me plenty, but because of the calm in his voice while he said it. There had been no pride in it, no threat, just the flat, quiet tone of a man describing something as mundane as locking a door. The council learned about the incident 2 days later, not from any formal report, since there was no treaty obligating Earth to file one, but from the Taurini delegation itself, who arrived at an emergency session demanding to know why the council had not protected a legally reassigned territory from what they called an unlawful act of aggression. I was in the gallery for that session. I watched Speaker Corvain try to explain, in front of 1,000 worlds worth of representatives, that the council had no standing to intervene, because the council no longer had a treaty with the party who had acted. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting after the original walkout. It was the silence of a room slowly realizing a truth it did not want to face. The council's authority had always depended on every species needing something from it: protection, arbitration, a shared law to fall back on. Humanity had simply proven that a species with enough capability did not need any of that. They only needed the will to act on their own behalf. And once one species proves that, others start to wonder if they need the council at all. 3 smaller delegations, species I had barely spoken to in all my years here, approached me privately over the following week, each with some version of the same question, always asked quietly, always asked as though it were somehow shameful to even wonder. "If humanity can simply act without permission and suffer no consequence," one of them asked me, a soft-spoken representative from a young colonial species called the Ethol, "then what, precisely, are the rest of us paying for?" I did not have an answer for her. I am not sure the council did either. Meanwhile, the Drennick Combine, the ones I had overheard in the corridor days earlier, grew bolder rather than more cautious. I think, in hindsight, they mistook Earth's restraint at Corvid's Reach for the limit of their capability, rather than a demonstration of it. They began moving ships along the edge of a shared border zone, a stretch of space that had been jointly patrolled under an old treaty framework, testing, I believe, how far they could push before anyone reacted. Daniel told me later that Earth watched them for 9 days without comment. 9 days of small incursions, each one slightly bolder than the last. Each one met with total silence from the human side. On the 10th day, every Drenic vessel in that border zone lost power for exactly 11 minutes. Not damaged, not destroyed. Simply and completely without power, drifting in the dark, while a single human courier ship passed slowly along the length of the border, close enough for every drifting Drenic captain to see it, and then continued on its way without firing a single shot or sending a single message. Power returned to every Drenic vessel at the same moment, down to the second. No one needed the message translated. The Drenic Combine withdrew from the border zone within the day and did not return. I remember sitting with Daniel again after that, turning my drink slowly in my hands, trying to understand what I was feeling. Fear, certainly, but also something else. Something I was ashamed of at first, because it felt disloyal to my own species' role in all of this. Something close to respect. Why didn't you fire on them? I asked him. You had every justification. They violated the border first. Because firing on them would have started something we didn't need to start, he said. We didn't leave the council because we wanted a war, Vesa. We left because we were tired of a system that let smaller injustices pile up until they became impossible to fix quietly. Corvid's Reach, the border zone. Neither needed force. They needed a clear demonstration that we were done being ignored. And if a demonstration is not enough next time? He did not answer that question. I do not think he had an answer to give. The speaker summoned me again 3 days later, this time not to his private chamber, but to a small closed session with only 4 other senior council staff present, all of them older, all of them far more powerful than I was ever meant to be in this institution. I understood, sitting in that room, that I had become something I had never intended to become, not a liaison anymore, something closer to a translator between 2 worlds that no longer spoke the same diplomatic language. We need to know what they want, Corvain said, without preamble. Not what they said in that chamber, what they actually want, underneath it. I thought of Daniel's face when he described the border zone. I thought of the buried rulings, the quiet erasures, the years of patience that had run out, not in anger, but in exhaustion. They want the same thing every species in this room wants, I said. To matter, to be heard before a decision is made, not informed politely after it is finished. The difference is, they no longer believe this council is capable of giving them that, and I am no longer certain they are wrong. The silence in that room lasted a long time, long enough that I began to wonder if I had just ended my own career with a single honest sentence. Instead, the oldest senator present, a quiet, ancient being named Thessaly Vorn, who rarely spoke in open session, finally broke the silence. Then we had better find a way to prove them wrong, she said, because if we cannot, others will follow where they led, and this council will not survive being irrelevant to the species it was built to serve. I left that meeting with a strange, heavy feeling in my chest, something between dread and a fragile, unfamiliar hope. For the first time since the walkout, someone in a position of real power had said out loud what I had been afraid to admit even to myself. The old system was already failing. The only question left was whether anyone with the power to fix it would act before it broke completely. I did not know yet that the true test of that question was still ahead of us, and that it would not come from a border skirmish or a stalled trade route. It would come from an old, cruel power at the edge of known space, one that had been watching humanity's withdrawal with far more patience and far worse intentions than either the Drenic or the Tauranai had ever shown. Its name, when I first heard it spoken in a closed session weeks later, made even Senator Vorn go quiet. The Kesh Directorate. I had heard the name Kesh Directorate only twice before that closed session, both times in old historical briefings about conflicts settled before I was born, treated the way one treats an old scar, something to be aware of but not afraid of. I learned quickly how wrong that impression was. The Kesh were not like the Drenic or the Tauranai. They did not test borders out of ambition or petty rivalry. They expanded, because expansion was the only law their culture truly believed in, and for 3 centuries they had been held back from human space by exactly one thing, a mutual defense clause buried in an old regional treaty, one that guaranteed any attack on humanity would draw an immediate, coordinated response from 4 allied fleets across the sector. That treaty had expired the moment Owen Hale walked out of the chamber. I learned this from Senator Vaughan herself, in a private briefing she requested with only myself and Daniel present, an arrangement so far outside normal protocol that I almost refused to attend out of simple caution. I am glad I did not. The Kesh have been quiet for 11 years, she told us, her voice low, careful, the voice of someone choosing every word with the weight of consequence behind it. Quiet does not mean idle. It means patient, and patience, for the Kesh, always ends the same way. You think they will move against Earth, Daniel said. It was not really a question. I think, Vaughan said, that a treaty which held them back for 3 centuries no longer exists, and they are not a people who fail to notice an open door. I remember the cold that settled over me in that room. Not fear for myself, though there was some of that too, but something sharper, more personal. I had spent 4 years among humans. I had watched their strange, stubborn, endlessly resilient culture up close, had come to care for them in a way I had never expected to when I first took this assignment. The thought of the Kesh turning their attention toward Earth's borders was not an abstract diplomatic concern to me anymore. It was something closer to dread for people I considered, in whatever quiet way an Ashari allows herself such things, friends. Does Earth know? I asked. Earth, Daniel said quietly, has known for longer than any of us. They do not withdraw from something this large without calculating every consequence first. I would wager they saw this exact scenario coming before they ever stood up in that chamber. Then why leave anyway? Why remove the very protection that kept the Kesh at bay? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, tapping his knuckles against his knee in that familiar, careful rhythm. Because a shield that only protects you while it also lets others erase your claims without your consent is not really a shield, he finally said. It's a leash with one end tied to your throat and the other end held by whoever is currently strongest in the room. We decided we would rather face a real threat honestly than keep living under a false promise of safety. I did not have a response to that. I am not certain there was one to give. Over the following 2 weeks, the signs grew harder to ignore. Kesh scout vessels, usually confined to their own territory by long habit, rather than any active enforcement, began appearing at the edges of human trade lanes. Not attacking, not even communicating. Simply present, watching, the way a predator watches long before it moves. The council convened an emergency session, the largest since the original walkout, and for the first time I watched genuine panic take hold of a room built entirely around the pretense of calm, rational governance. Delegates who had spent years treating humanity's absence as an inconvenient footnote suddenly understood, all at once, that an unprotected human border was not a problem contained to Earth alone. If the Kesh moved against humanity and succeeded, there would be nothing stopping them from turning that same hunger toward the next open border, and the one after that. Senator Vaughan stood before the full assembly, and for the first time in all my years serving this council, I heard real urgency in her voice, instead of practiced composure. We built a system, she said, that punished patience and rewarded delay, and we told ourselves it was fairness, because it applied its slowness equally to everyone. But equal slowness is not justice, when the cost of that slowness falls hardest on those with the least power to absorb it. Humanity paid that cost for years. Now every species in this chamber may pay it in a very different currency, because we allowed a shield to fall that protected far more than just one world. The chamber was silent after that. Not the silence of confusion, the way it had been after the walkout. The silence of understanding, finally, far too late, what had actually been lost. I was asked, along with Daniel, to travel personally to the edge of human space, to the border station nearest the growing Kesh presence, in an unofficial capacity meant to open some line of communication between Earth and the Council before anything irreversible happened. I remember standing at the observation deck of that station, watching sensor readouts track slow, deliberate movements of unfamiliar ships along the dark edge of the display, and feeling, for the first time in my long life, genuinely afraid of what the next data point might show. Daniel stood beside me, calm in a way I still could not fully understand. "They are testing patrol response times," he said quietly, studying the readout. "Standard Kesh doctrine before a real incursion. Probe, measure, retreat, then come back heavier." How long before they stop probing and start acting? Days, maybe less. And Earth's response? He turned to look at me then, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something in his expression that was not calm at all. It was resolve, sharpened into something almost physical. "Earth has been preparing an answer to this exact scenario since before the walkout," he said. "We are not walking into this blind, Vesa, but I will not pretend to you that the cost of what comes next will be small. It will not." I did not sleep at all that night. I lay awake listening to the quiet hum of the station's systems, thinking of Owen Hale's steady hands in that chamber weeks ago, of the buried rulings I had found in the archive, of the 11 minutes the Drenic fleet spent drifting powerless in the dark. Every piece of it had led, step by careful step, to this moment, to a border station on the edge of known space where an old and hungry empire had finally decided the leash was gone and the door was open. I did not yet know how humanity would answer that hunger. I only knew, lying in the dark, that whatever came next would decide far more than the fate of a single mining route or a single stretch of contested space. It would decide whether the Galactic Council, in trying to hold 1,000 worlds together through slow, comfortable neglect, had finally broken the one relationship it could not afford to lose. The Kesh fleet crossed the border 6 days later. I was there when it happened, standing on that same observation deck, watching sensor readings shift from a handful of scout vessels to a formation too large for the display to render cleanly, ship after ship blooming across the screen like a slow, spreading stain. Daniel stood beside me, and for the first time since I had known him, his hands were not steady at all. "That's not a probe," he said quietly. "That's an invasion formation." I felt the floor tilt beneath me, though the station had not moved at all. "How many ships?" "More than we've seen from them in a generation." He was already moving toward the communications console, fingers flying across controls I did not recognize, his voice dropping into something clipped and precise. The voice, I understood now, of a man who had trained for exactly this moment and had simply hoped never to need it. "Vesa, I need you to contact the Council. Tell them what you're seeing. Tell them exactly what you're seeing, with no softening, no diplomatic phrasing. They need the truth faster than they've ever needed it in their lives." I did as he asked, patching a direct channel through to Senator Vaughn's office, my voice shaking in a way I was not proud of as I described the formation crossing the border in real time. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, her silence stretched long enough that I feared the connection had failed. "Vesa," she finally said, "does Earth intend to fight this alone?" I looked at Daniel, who had gone very still, listening to something through an earpiece I could not hear, his expression unreadable. "I do not know," I told her honestly, "but I believe we are about to find out exactly what humanity is capable of when no one is holding them back." What followed over the next several hours was unlike anything I had witnessed in all my years of service. I will try to describe it as plainly as I can, because the truth of it needs no exaggeration. The Kesh fleet advanced in 3 staggered waves, standard doctrine meant to overwhelm any single point of defense before reinforcements could arrive. Human forces did not meet them head-on in the way the Kesh clearly expected. Instead, the first wave found its long-range sensors returning false readings, guiding them toward a rendezvous point that did not exist, scattering their formation across empty space long enough for the second wave to arrive without support. The second wave found its communications jammed the moment it crossed the border, cutting it off from coordinating with the first, and its navigational systems subtly, almost undetectably, nudged off course by a margin too small to notice immediately but large enough, over the following hour, to place it directly into the path of an asteroid field human survey teams had mapped in exhaustive detail years earlier, and the Kesh had never bothered to study at all. The third wave, the true invasion force carrying ground assault capability, found itself entirely alone by the time it reached what should have been a defended border, and instead of the resistance its doctrine had trained it to expect, it found something far more unsettling. Nothing at all, an empty stretch of space, quiet and undefended, drawing it deeper and deeper toward Earth's inner systems, exactly as its commanders had hoped. It was a trap, and by the time the Kesh commanders realized it, they were already inside it. I learned the details later, pieced together from reports Daniel was permitted to share once the crisis had passed, and even filtered through careful diplomatic language. The scale of what humanity had accomplished in those hours left me staggered. No massive battle, no dramatic final confrontation of the kind old stories tell, just a patient, meticulous unraveling of an enemy's confidence, wave by wave, until the invasion force that had crossed the border with such certainty found itself stranded, isolated, and utterly unable to complete the mission it had been sent to carry out. The Kesh commander, faced with a fleet scattered across 3 separate traps with no way to coordinate a retreat, let alone an attack, did the only thing left available to him. He requested contact, not with the Galactic Council, with Earth directly. I was present, in an advisory capacity only, for that final exchange, patched through on a secure council channel that Senator Vorn insisted on monitoring personally, given everything at stake. Owen Hale himself appeared on the screen, the same steady hands from that first chamber all those weeks ago, though his face now carried the weight of everything that had happened since. "You crossed into territory you had no claim to," Owen said, expecting an empty response, because you believed the absence of a treaty meant the absence of consequence. "I want to be clear about something before we discuss terms. This was never about territory for us. It was never about proving a point to your empire specifically. It was about making sure every species watching understood exactly what changes when you remove the fiction and leave only the truth of what a people are actually capable of." The Kesh commander said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the confidence it must have held 6 days earlier. "What are your terms?" "Immediate and full withdrawal," Owen said. "No further incursions along this border, formalized not through the Council, since we no longer answer to it, but through a direct agreement between your government and ours, one with real consequences attached if it is broken. And one more thing, you will confirm, publicly, that this was an unprovoked act of aggression against an independent power, not a border dispute, not a misunderstanding. The truth, stated plainly, for every delegation in that council chamber to hear." I understood, listening to that final demand, exactly what Owen Hale was doing. This was never only about defending Earth's border. It was about making certain that every species watching, every delegation that had assumed humanity's withdrawal, left them weak and unprotected, understood the truth beyond any possible doubt. Humanity had not left the Council because they were afraid of standing alone. They had left because standing alone, on their own terms, was safer than remaining inside a system that quietly failed to protect them while pretending that it did. The Kesh commander agreed to every term. He had no other choice left available to him. When the news reached the full council session 2 days later, I watched the chamber absorb it in a silence unlike any I had witnessed before, heavier even than the day of the original walkout. Species that had spent weeks quietly wondering whether the council still mattered now had their answer delivered in the plainest possible terms. A treaty had not saved anyone from that invasion. Humanity's own capability, judgment, and willingness to act without waiting for anyone's permission had. Senator Vorn rose to address the chamber, and for the first time in all my years serving under her, I heard something in her voice that sounded almost like grief for an institution she had spent her entire long life trying to hold together. We built a system meant to protect every species equally, she said, and instead, we built one that protected the patient at the expense of the vulnerable, that mistook slowness for fairness and neglect for balance. Humanity showed us, at great risk to themselves, exactly what that failure costs. I do not believe we can continue pretending otherwise, not after what nearly happened, and not after what it took to prevent it. I do not know, sitting in that chamber, whether the council fully understood yet what needed to change. I only knew, watching Owen Hale's steady hands on that screen days earlier, that humanity had never wanted to prove they did not need anyone. They had simply refused, finally and completely, to need anyone on terms that left them unheard, unprotected, and quietly erased from decisions that shaped their own future. That refusal had nearly cost them everything. It had also, in the end, been the only thing that saved them. The weeks that followed the Kesh withdrawal were unlike any period I had experienced in my long service to the Council. There was no single dramatic session, no grand reconciliation staged for the historical record. Instead, there was something slower and, I think, far more honest. A quiet, uncomfortable reckoning that spread through every delegation, every committee, every private conversation held in the corridors of a station that had spent generations believing its own myths about fairness. I was summoned to Senator Vaughan's office a final time, though this meeting felt different from the others. She did not pace. She sat across from me with the calm, worn patience of someone who had spent a very long life watching institutions rise, and occasionally, painfully, learn. "I have read your reports from the last 2 years," she said. "Every one of them, the buried rulings, the stalled appeals. I want you to know that I believe you understood what was happening long before the rest of us were willing to see it." "I did not act quickly enough on what I understood," I said. "That is not something I am proud of." "None of us acted quickly enough," she said. "That is the nature of institutions built by many hands and many species, each one certain someone else will notice the cracks first. I am not interested in assigning blame today. I am interested in what we build next." She told me, that afternoon, of the proposal she intended to bring before the full council. Not cosmetic reform, not the kind of symbolic gesture that changes nothing but the wording of a document nobody reads. A genuine restructuring of how disputes were reviewed, with fixed timelines that could not be quietly extended through procedural delay, and an independent review process for any ruling that a delegation believed had been decided in bad faith. It would not be popular among the older, more established species, the ones who had benefited quietly for generations from a system that rewarded patience and connections over fairness. She knew that. She intended to propose it anyway. "Do you believe Earth will return to the Council?" I asked her, "if these reforms pass?" "I do not know," she said honestly. "I believe Daniel Rourke, and the woman I understand now leads their delegation in all but title, Grace Doyle, would tell us that trust rebuilt, after a wound this deep, does not return quickly, no matter how sincere the effort. I believe we owe them the effort regardless, whether or not they ever choose to sit at this table again." I thought of Owen Hale's steady hands, of Daniel's careful, patient voice, describing 11 minutes of powerless drift, as though it were the mildest thing in the world, of the quiet dread I had felt on that observation deck, watching a Kesh invasion fleet blossom across the display. I understood, sitting in that office, that whatever came next would not undo what had already happened. It would only decide whether the galaxy had actually learned something from it, or whether it would simply wait for the next crisis to force the same lesson upon it again. I did not have to wait long for my answer. 3 months later, I received a message from Daniel, the first personal communication between us since the crisis had ended, formal channels having occupied every hour of both our lives in the time since. He asked to meet, not on the council station this time, but on neutral ground, a quiet trade outpost near the border where the Kesh invasion had nearly begun. I agreed without hesitation. He looked different when I saw him again. Lighter, somehow, though the careful, measured way he chose his words remained exactly the same. "The reforms passed," he said, before I could even ask. Vaughn's proposal, independent review boards, fixed timelines, real consequences for delegations that stall appeals in bad faith. I had heard, I said. I did not know if Earth was watching closely enough to notice. We are always watching, he said, with something close to a smile. That was never the problem. The problem was that watching without power to act meant nothing. Now, at least, there is a system that claims it will not require us to have that power in reserve just to be heard. Claims, I repeated. You do not fully trust it yet. No, he admitted, but Grace Doyle put it to me this way before I came here. Trust is not something you demand back all at once. It's something you rebuild one honest decision at a time, and you watch closely to see if the other side keeps showing up to do the work, even when no one is forcing them to. He paused. The Council does not know this yet, but Earth has agreed, quietly, informally, to send a delegation back to observe the first full session under the new review process, not to rejoin as a full member, simply to watch and to see whether the changes are real or simply words dressed up as reform. I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in months, a knot I had not fully realized I was still carrying. And if it is real, I asked. Then perhaps, Daniel said, we find our way back to that chamber, on terms that actually mean something this time. Not because we need the Council to protect us. We have already proven we do not need that. But because 1,000 worlds working honestly together will always accomplish more than any one of them standing entirely alone, no matter how capable that one world might be. We sat together for a long while after that, watching traffic move slowly through the outpost, human ships and Ashari ships, and a dozen other species passing peacefully alongside one another, none of them aware of how close all of it had come to unraveling months earlier over a single buried trade ruling and years of quiet, unnoticed neglect. I think often, even now, of Owen Hale standing in that chamber, his hands perfectly steady, delivering words that shattered a system 1,000 worlds had built their entire understanding of safety upon. I do not believe he wanted the crisis that followed. I do not believe any reasonable person could have wanted it. But I have come to understand something in the months since, something I did not fully grasp on that first day when the silence fell across the chamber. Sometimes the only way to prove a shield was never truly protecting you is to set it down entirely and see, in the honest light left behind, who actually comes to stand beside you once the illusion is gone. Humanity found their answer to that question in the quiet after their own silence. I like to believe, watching Daniel Rourke smile for the first time in months at a small trade outpost on the edge of a border that had nearly become a battlefield, that the rest of us are only now beginning to find ours. The Council survived. Whether it deserved to is a question I suspect history will spend a long time answering. But for the first time since I entered this chamber as a young, hopeful liaison, I believe it might actually be trying to earn that answer honestly. And for a system built on 1,000 worlds worth of patience, worn thin by 1,000 worlds worth of neglect, I have come to think that trying honestly, at last, might be the only thing that was ever truly required of it all along.